Welcome, everyone. I'm Kat Lloyd, Vice President of Programs here at the Tenement Museum. Thank you so much for joining us for our final program of our Three Historians season this year. Our series so far has explored the laws around immigration and citizenship from the 1860s onwards, including the 15th Amendment, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Johnson-Reed Act, and the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. If you're just tuning in now, I invite you to go back and watch our other programs, because tonight's conversation takes us to the most recent immigration legislation of the series that builds on almost all of the other ones. Tonight's topic is the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. This law might be lesser known than some of the others, but is one of the most transformative amnesty programs of the 20th century, allowing millions of undocumented immigrants to adjust their status to become permanent residents. Tonight, we'll look at this law in context of other amnesty programs, including the pre-examination program of the 1930s, which allowed thousands of undocumented European immigrants to adjust their status. Among those European immigrants who adjusted their status was Rosaria Baldizzi, who lived at 97 Orchard Street and whose family story we tell in our Under One Roof tour. Rosaria had been undocumented for 2 decades by the time she was able to go through this program in 1945, finally becoming a naturalized citizen in 1948. It is my honor to introduce tonight's guests, who are not only the foremost experts on the 1986 legislation, but also testified in Congress during its passage and worked on its implementation. Muzaffar Chishti is a lawyer and senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, as well as the director of the Migration Policy Institute at the NYU School of Law. His work focuses on U.S. immigration policy at the federal, state, and local levels. Chishti was previously the director of the Immigration Project of the Union of Needle Trades, Industrial, and Textile Employees. Charles Kamasaki currently serves as a senior advisor of Unidos US, the nation's largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization, and is a distinguished visiting scholar at Cornell University. Previously the executive director of Unidos US, for 2 decades he managed the group's research, policy analysis, and advocacy activity. Kamasaki is also the author of Immigration Reform, The Corpse That Will Not Die, about the law on which we'll focus tonight. Moderating the discussion is Reichlin-Melnick, the policy director of the American Immigration Council, where he oversees the council's administrative and legislative advocacy efforts. Tonight's program is made possible by support from the New York State Council for the Arts, the New York State Legislature, and Con Edison. Additional support is provided by the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the National Park Service, and the National Park Foundation. And, of course, by support of our visitors and members like you. If you're able, please consider making a donation of any size to support our virtual programming. And as always, you are part of tonight's discussion. Share your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll pass them along to our guests. And for tonight, we should call this series 2 lawyers and 1 policy analyst walk into a saloon. So I will pass it over now to Reichlin-Melnick.
Hi, good evening, Muz and Charles. It's great to have both of you here today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I want to start with the most basic question. What is the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, and why are we here talking about it today? We'll start with you.
Well, thank you. I guess I get the privilege of being on the home turf. I am from New York, and I just want to give huge credit for the union, the International Ladies Government Workers Union, which gave me really the opportunity to become an immigration expert that I am today. We represented Jewish and Italian workers from the beginning of the 20th century till the union merged with men's clothing and textile workers. We represented a large number of workers just a few blocks from here, who by the time I came to the union were Chinese Americans. So I have a great place in my heart for that union. Well, I mean, part of it actually I learned at the union itself. I mean, before the 1970s, there was actually no recognition that there were unauthorized people in the US. And people thought that everyone was an immigrant. If you spoke with a certain amount of accent, you must be an immigrant. No one really focused on the status. In fact, since this is a culmination of your various historical episodes that the Tenement Museum has covered, till 1921, there were actually no numerical limits for people to enter the United States. People find it hard to believe that there were some people we didn't like. We didn't like prostitutes or terrorists or people who had communicable diseases, but no numerical limits. We established that in 1924 and established the national origin quota system, which remained the law till 1965. In 1965, a promise made by President Kennedy in his campaign, but delivered by President Johnson after he became president. We equalized the opportunities of the world for the whole of America to the whole world. At 1970, it was fundamentally European migration. 85% of our migration was either European or Canadian. Today, it's the reverse. So you can see why there is unease about it. But part of what happened in 1965, which is less known and more relevant to our debate, is that for the first time we put Western Hemisphere in the quota limits of people we admitted. Before that, if you came from Mexico, Southern America, there were no limits for you to come. So we put now quota limits. And we also ended the Bracero program, which had been a hall of shame from 1946 to 64. So if you went and look at those two factors, suddenly there were opportunities for Mexicans and a lot of Central Americans and South Americans. They could no longer come to the US. So there was a rise in the unauthorized population beginning in 1970. This came to public perception only in 1972. I think the record shows the first hearing Congress held on so-called amnesty was in 1972, when actually a Monsignor from here, Monsignor Tony Bevilacqua, who ran a parish in Brooklyn, testified before Chairman Rodino. And Rodino asked him, so what do we do with these unauthorized people? He said, we should grant them amnesty. And Rodino laughed. He said, we can't do that. That's not what we do as a country. So from that laugh to actual realization of a legislation that granted people the right to legalize the status is what this process of IRCA was. It took obviously from 72 to 86 to happen. There was a congressional commission established, bipartisan, during Carter, and it delivered its report during Reagan's times, which endorsed legalization. So it came as a recommendation of a bipartisan commission. But that bipartisan commission did other things, but we can get into them. But the genesis is 65, 70, commission, and then the enactment of the law in 86.
So, of course, you know, as you documented, the way we got to IRCA in 1986 was convoluted. And Charles, you actually wrote a book about this called Immigration Reform, The Corpse That Will Not Die, in which you sort of got into this in painstaking detail about just how much effort it took to get there. But you know, Muz, you talked about the amnesty part of 1986, but 1986 was more than that. Would you just sort of for those in the audience who might not really know what was included in that bill, could you just give a quick overview of what actually it was part of that?
Happy to do that. I think many of us forget that this legislation started off as an enforcement bill. And it started off as mainly an enforcement bill because of the phenomenon Muzaffar mentioned, high rates of unauthorized migration from the South. So the bill, as it was finally enacted, included something called employer sanctions, penalties against employers for hiring unauthorized immigrants. For the first time, we made it unlawful to knowingly hire an undocumented immigrant. There was also authorization for significantly increased border enforcement. There were some slight changes to the asylum system, although as initially proposed, there were supposed to be very significant cuts and restrictions on the asylum system. And there were also some temporary worker programs that were quite consequential. One was a relatively modest one for agricultural workers, and that was kind of consistent with what had been in the law for a long time and what we see today. The other was the so-called Special Agricultural Worker Program, which was consequential in a number of ways. The first is many attribute that provision to kind of cutting the Gordian knot that allowed the bill to finally be enacted. And just to set the stage for you, organized labor, particularly the United Farm Workers and Latino civil rights organizations, one of which I worked at, vehemently opposed those kinds of programs because of the exploitation inherent in those programs, right? If you come, you don't have permanent status, you don't have full labor rights, you are very vulnerable to employers exploiting you. But Western growers in particular saw that as essential to their business. They really heavily relied on unauthorized workers and frankly still do. So there was kind of this standoff for a number of years. And a guy named Chuck Schumer, who was then a quasi-well-known congressman from Brooklyn, kind of stepped up and said, well, I will negotiate the compromise. And he brought together a guy named Howard Berman, congressman from California, representing the United Farm Workers in essence, and Leon Panetta, another guy who from California eventually became famous, representing agricultural interests that were dominant in his district. And they pushed and pulled and negotiated for really about 18 months. And finally, the breakthrough was something that Dolores Huerta, who some of you may know, that's then the vice president of the United Farm Workers, said, why are we fighting about this? Why don't we just give them green cards? And if you let workers in with green cards, we'll sign off. Now, this was kind of an audacious proposal, right? It had been brought up and rejected. In fact, many of us had thought of the idea and said, Congress will never do that. And Schumer, really by force of will and skill and tenacity, kept coming back and coming back and coming back, and ultimately it was the revision that allowed the bill to happen. And consequentially, instead of having hundreds of thousands of exploitable temporary workers, it resulted in more than 1 million workers agricultural workers with green cards.
Now, as Catherine stated at the start of this wasn't the first amnesty that we ever had in U.S. history, but it may have been the largest. How does the 1986 amnesty fit within the history of Congress providing some relief for undocumented immigrants or those who lacked formal legal status in the 20th century?
I'll take that.
But there's no comparison. I mean, this is by scale a totally different phenomenon. As I said, there were like no unauthorized people till 1921. You really couldn't be unauthorized. So the unauthorization started when we started putting these quota limits. So 1921, when we put our first temporary quota, which became permanent in 24, of which the 100th anniversary will be celebrated this year. And you will see our former President Trump making a big deal about the 100th anniversary of the 24 as though we should go back to 1924. You will really hear a lot about this. So because of that quota limits, illegal immigration started becoming a phenomenon. So the first time Congress enacted a provision for legalization was the Registry Act of 1929, which basically said, look, it was like what we in normal other contexts of law call statute of limitation. That if you've stayed here 5 years, if you're good moral character, and if you're not a public charge, you have not committed criminal offense, we'll give you a green card. And the numbers were small. So that, and the cutoff point was 5 years, I think. It was 1919. So that cutoff date essentially has been moved up every few years, which is what we call the registry program. The last time it was before 1986, when we also moved the registry day up in that law, it was till 1958. So if you had not come here before 1958, there was no chance for you to get legalized. So that's why the 86 thing was really important. In 86 law, we escalated it to 1972. So that was the big thing. But can I just say something about your conversation with Charles and is that how personalities are so terribly important in these things, that we kind of think that these are, forces of nature and historical things, but they are really important. I mean, Schumer at that point, I remember distinctly, I was a really young lobbyist and not as savvy as Charles, and everyone smoked those days. I remember entering the Judiciary Committee room meeting at 7 o'clock at night, and Chair Rodino's cheering over this. People have come after dinner, and the amendment process goes. And Schumer, in his completely arrogant way, looked at his watch and said, "This is the moment everyone has been waiting for. That I'm going to tell you the deal I've struck with Berman and Panetta." That was so important that some 3 members of Congress were delegated by the entire Congress to do their bidding on you trusted people, that look, you represent our interests, and if they agree on it, it was respected by, that just wouldn't happen today. Not to mention the 3 of them were roommates in DC. So all those things matter a lot in terms of chemistry. Rodino, who was chair, was a child of immigrant from Newark, who had really, in Charles's book, comes out extremely well, felt that he had been badly treated by the white upper class members of Congress when he was a young congressman because he was from the other side of the tracks. He never forgot that. That for him to do justice for the immigrants was really important. Then Ellen Simpson, who was a senator from Wyoming, who had almost, would normally there were no immigrants from Wyoming, but he happened to have Japanese internment camp people in Wyoming. And that had seared into his psyche that we had not treated immigrants in the past well. He was a Republican. He was a close aide to Bush. So the fact that these cast of characters came together is what he would, he had also a very folksy method. Talk about what were the elements. He would call Urca a 3-legged stool. He would not leave anywhere unless calling it the 3-legged stool as to what the 3 legs were. So the cast of these characters together, and then Reagan. We really forget how important a President Reagan was.
Well, on the 3-legged stool in particular, for those not familiar, the 3 legs were enforcement, employer sanctions, and amnesty, and all of those went together. But getting to that 3-legged stool took time, took many years of fighting, both of which, during that time, you were both intimately involved. So I'll start with you, Charles. If you want to just let people know a little bit about what role you played in getting that 3-legged stool actually passed into law.
Well, I was a very junior lobbyist, policy analyst at the National Council of La Raza. Got to the issue completely by accident. Basically, the guy who had been covering immigration left the organization to move and get married. And they were kind of looking around. They're like, okay, so who's going to cover immigration? And I was kind of like, I guess I will. And this was 1983, just when the bill was getting super hot. But let me step back and talk about, I think Muzaffar's interjection about personalities is really important, but I think your question about where does this fit in the context of previous legalizations is also very important, because there's a really critical factor here, which Muzaffar alluded to, which is race. So there weren't many unauthorized immigrants prior to 1970 because we had all sorts of mechanisms in our laws, not just formal amnesties, not just statutes of limitations, but also there were also administrative amnesties granted by the executive back before those things would have been litigated, and there was also there were customs and practices, such as the INS almost never deported someone with U.S. citizen kids. So many of those things began to be eliminated in the 1965 Act, the statutory ceilings that Muzaffar mentioned. And in 1976, legislation was passed that actually prohibited INS from this policy of not deporting people with U.S. citizen kids. Now, why, after all these decades of relative generosity towards people who might not have come in the right way, did things change? And I think it's really clearly because of who the immigrants were, where they were coming from. So think about Mexico in particular. We had the end of the Bracero program that Muzaffar mentioned. At its height, 800,000 people were allowed into the U.S. to work temporarily in agriculture. Then you had the imposition of limitations on legal immigration. We also actually formally cut legal immigration quotas from Mexico in that 1976 bill. And all of this coincided with the peak fertility rate in Mexican history, which meant that you had more and more workers that their economy wasn't able to absorb. So in part, right, there was not just this phenomenon of unauthorized immigration, there was this very racialized phenomenon of unauthorized migration. And so the kinds of things you're hearing today, invasion, national security threats, changing the character of our country, the browning of America, all of those were very common in the 70s and leading up to this legislation. So to actually answer your question, so I was a very junior lobbyist working in a Latino civil rights organization at a time when it wasn't clear that Latino civil rights organizations had any standing to deal with these issues, right? There was almost no Latino population. It was less than 5%, according to the 1980 census. And the folks who had traditionally worked on immigration were kind of the Eastern European-based old guard, including people like the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And so in my history, we kind of had to fight to get to the table. And then once we got to the table, other than thinking, oh my God, we're at the table, what do we do now? We basically opposed the legislation until we basically got a legalization program that we were able to live with. Muzaffar had a slightly different history, so he should talk about that as well.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
Well, mine, excuse me, mine is briefer, I think. So well, as I said early on, I was at the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which had a huge history of immigration, rooted in Jewish and Italian migration, or migrants who formed the union. And by the time I arrived there, it had become almost exclusively Chinese and Latino. And we started noticing unauthorized migration. How it happened was we couldn't tell, this is before sanctions. Before sanctions, you could not ask anyone about their papers. So there was a union member, we had no way of knowing whether they were legal or not. The employer had no way of knowing. So we assumed everyone was legal. Till we started having raids at factories. And we started having raids at arbitrators' offices. And the union's leadership said, what the hell is going on? Then we realized the people who were really, who were connected members, that we had unauthorized. So that's how we came to understand this. So we had to take a position. So this commission was working at this time. Our union, to its huge credit, at huge sort of risk at that time, became the first union in the country to ask for legalization. It was kind of an earth-shaking thing, because unions were generally supposed to be against immigrants, because they were competitors to US workers. So my job, and I was not even really, I was a lawyer, really I was given the task is that how does a union whose job is to protect American workers have a pro-immigrant policy? So I started dabbling into labor economics and sociology, and got hold of Michael Piore, who was a well-known economist at MIT, who wrote a very famous book called The Birds of Passage, as to how there's not competition between immigrant workers and US workers. They operate in different labor markets, what he calls the dual labor market. Wow, dual labor market, it's a theory. So loaded with that theory, I convinced my bosses that this was not a competitive situation. And union adopted, then it became sort of part of my job to convince the rest of the AFL-CIO, for which I was too young to do, too junior to do, but the president of the union was able to do. So the AFL-CIO changed its position on immigration. I think I can say this without contradiction. If AFL-CIO had not supported amnesty, there would have been no amnesty. But AFL-CIO was a big supporter of sanctions. That's why we got the two important sort of legs of the stool. That's really how the two were tied. And once the two were tied, AFL got on board. Once the two were tied, they got on board. But let me just finish with one thing. All the leftist organizations at that time opposed the bill. It's an unknown fact that the progressives opposed the bill. Ted Kennedy, the ultimate champion of immigrants in the country, did not support the bill.
Not overtly, although he covertly.
Because of sanctions. Because sanctions was seen as such a poison thing for the left, that as if this is making a deal with the devil. How could you do that? I mean, I'm telling you, I would go into audiences where I would get booed, heckled. I mean, do you know what it's like to get heckled by friends for having accepted sanctions? That was the level of political opposition to it. So it's basically the centrists at the end of the day who brought the legislation along. And that's reflected even in the votes, both on the Democratic and the Republican side. I think extreme Republicans and extreme Democrats did not vote for that bill.
You know, it's interesting because you framed a lot of this in the terms of the labor movement and working. And I think back to 1977, President Carter gave a speech on undocumented workers, was the phrase he used. Not undocumented immigrants, not, illegal aliens, undocumented workers, because this was viewed by many through a labor lens, and employer sanctions were part of that. For those in the audience who are not familiar, the I-9, the form you have to fill out to work, was created by IRCA. It did not exist before 1986. And so the idea of employer sanctions, you passed it into law, and surely that solved everything. We don't have undocumented immigrants working in this country anymore. That, what happened with that? What was the sort of the legacy of that pillar of the stool?
Well, in fairness to some of us, we predicted employer sanctions would not work. And not because we were, particularly brilliant or anything. And there are those who would say, well, the reason they never worked is because we don't have a national ID card in this country, which you need to be able to prove, who is authorized to work and who isn't. I think there's actually a somewhat more political, and there's also an economic reason. So the political reason is, as a country, we are not very tough on enforcing labor laws, and in lots of contexts, this is a labor law against businesses at all, right? Otherwise, nobody would ever be paid below the minimum wage. Otherwise, nobody would ever be forced to work more hours than they should be under the law. And in fact, we know that's actually quite rampant, particularly when the folks affected are lower income, predominantly people of color, right? So there's a political imbalance. But as we noted in a piece Muzaffar and I wrote 10 years ago, the MPI piece was 2014, I think. We also knew that different employers would react differently to something like saying you have to check the status of every worker you hire, right? So your typical businesses who want to comply with the law, who have HR departments, all of them comply virtually, right? So people would famously say, we're going to get 99% compliance, and there's probably something close to that. Here's the problem. The 1% who don't comply hire pretty much all the undocumented workers, right? So for them, it's a cost of doing business, and it's a risk worth taking, and there are all sorts of ways to evade responsibility. You call them contractors. You go through third parties. You know, there's all sorts of ways that you can evade liability, and I think, you know, what we have today demonstrates that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be less kind. I mean, I think it was actually the biggest fraud perpetrated on American people. I think, you know, this is capitalism. In capitalism, you believe employers should have right to hire anyone they want. That was why there were no employer sanctions laws till 1986. I mean, European countries, every one of them had employer sanctions, or we didn't, because it was considered a fundamental right of a capitalist to hire everyone they wanted. Okay, that's the basic. So this was curbed by members of Congress in this case, who just thought that this is the magical solution, that people are coming here for work, that if you demagnetize the magnet, that people will stop coming. Really, they'll stop coming. So what the employee groups did, they finally realized they had to take it. They watered down the provision as much as they could, almost watered it down to knowing in advance that this would be ineffective. To just the word, you're a lawyer, I'm a lawyer. The word knowingly is the most notorious word used in that statute, inserted by the Chamber of Commerce. And that time, because once you have knowingly, then how do you prove that employer is knowingly hiring unauthorized workers? So it became a very important, loophole, and that's what the loophole through which employers have been driving trucks since 1986. So if you had to ask someone coming from Mars, how were the employer sanctions effective? The fact that there are 11.5 million unauthorized people in the country today, 7 million of them are working, will tell you is proof positive it's not working.
And I think there were 12 fines issued last year against employers for violating employer sanctions. I think that number is correct.
And of course, there are multiple states in the United States that have mandatory e-verify, and yet there are still large undocumented populations in those states. And I think it's pretty widely accepted that so far efforts to prevent undocumented immigrants from working or to sanction employers just haven't succeeded. But moving on from enforcement a little bit, because from the employer sanctions, I want to talk a little bit about implementing the law itself, because it's one thing to pass a law, it's another one to implement it. And what were the initial successes and challenges of actually putting this new amnesty program into effect?
So let me take a stab at that, although Muz played a huge role in implementation. So the law assumed that, you know, some undocumented people might be nervous about coming forward and saying to the Immigration and Naturalization Service, hey, I'm undocumented, I want to apply for legalization. So it set up a system of third parties, basically, called qualified designated entities in perfect government speak, that were mainly community, not exclusively, but mainly community organizations. So about 40 of the affiliates of the then National Council of La Raza, now Unidos US, were these community-based organizations that participated in helping people to apply for the program. So the role that I played in those days, and you know, I really didn't know nearly as much as I thought I did, was theoretically advising those organizations about how to run those programs. We also, both Muzaffar and I, played slightly different roles at the national level because, as you know, Aaron, implementation is governed by a whole elaborate infrastructure. There's regulations, there's guidance and memos that are issued to a field staff by the agencies. So we worked a lot on regulations. We worked a lot on shaping the policies of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Actually, the predecessor organization to the American Immigration Council was called the American Immigration Law Foundation, which was established during IRCA under our good friend Warren Leiden. And they sued the INS a fair amount to force compliance with the statute. So we did a lot of those things. I'll let Moose talk about his role, and then I want to circle back to the significance of implementation.
Well, I'm glad you asked the question because I made a derision speech about sanctions, how it was. The implementation of IRCA, on the other hand, was brilliantly done, especially as government operations do. It will go down as one of the most successful operations, in my opinion, the federal government has ever undertaken, and the most cooperatively done with people like us. I mean, the country had never done something like this before. Immigration officers whose job was to arrest people on a daily basis for violating the law were told, you're going to give them green cards. Just imagine changing the psyche of that. So the leadership came from top. First it came from Congress. We convinced members of Congress that, I don't know how we came about with this, that look, I don't think immigrants are going to trust INS. So why don't you have these buffer things called the qualified designated entities? And we got them to pay us for doing it. We were paid $16 a person. I mean, paltry, but there was fee for submitting applications that so like Maria didn't go to INS, she came to the ILGW. We prepared her application, and then we took her. I would physically go with her. It just luckily happened to be the largest legalization office in the country was diagonally across from my office. So I would actually physically escort them and go to the interviews with them. At the end of the day, the smile on their face, a woman who has been unauthorized for suddenly has a card given to her by a bureaucrat. I tell you, that's worth everything you want to do as a lawyer. And imagine multiplying this across the country. They first of all made people in charge of the program who were committed to the program. They asked people to volunteer. They didn't force people to become head of LO, which means people who volunteered were already committed to this. Just think of that as good governance in the future. And then they opened them in new places, not in a place where immigrants are used to seeing people with handcuffs. They opened new offices. They had light music. They had good training. There was, as you used to call them, islands of civility in this thing. And they hired new people. For the first time in the history of INS, they hired people who had not carried a gun, which was a big departure at that time, to waive the requirement that to be that level. So it was a totally different approach. And then 90% of the application they approved. So that was taste of everything. So I think in terms of the culture of and they got people out of retirement to come and become. So all those things built a culture that made it really receptive. So much so that immigrants, after a while, to be in all honesty, when we had sold the idea that people will not come to, people started going directly to INS. They circumvented the QDEs because we were all bottlenecked. we were taking months to take a case. So from our office, they trusted INS after a while. So that to you is the ultimate proof that it actually worked.
Yeah,
and I would just say it had two very different kinds of impacts. So the first thing is almost all of the progressive immigrant rights organizations that you see today have their roots in the implementation of the Immigration Reform and Control Act. So the New York Immigration Coalition and many of its members started then. It also played a big role in, it got a lot of community organizing groups doing service. You know, it used to be back in the day that you either did organizing or you did services. You know, it was just too many lanes at the same time, right? You couldn't do both. Out of IRCA, you had dozens, maybe hundreds of organizations that started to both, they had done this service of legalizing people, and then they wanted to represent them in advocacy circles. And that has really completely changed the shape.
You would say the modern immigration movement came out of IRCA. The membership of ALA, which organization, went up from 3,000 to 10,000 in months.
For those not familiar, AILA is the American Immigration Lawyers Association.
But to tell you how we, on this side, we were like a ragtime. We had no time to, because it passed as a surprise. We didn't know it was going to happen. We all just, this is before internet, all the phones said, we need to do this collectively. I think Charles and I were actually co-chairs of this ad hoc coalition for the implementation of IRCA. We would meet in the basement of their office. And all national groups would come to the basement, go to the INS, do our bidding, do our negotiating, come back, tell everyone what we'd achieved, and the next day it would become the facts that went to everyone. That was the level of infrastructure we had, and it still worked.
And the other impact, I would say, is, and Aaron, you're familiar with this, when you do policy work in Washington, in those days, but even today, almost all of your work is done within the bubble, inside the beltway, right? You're writing papers, you're walking the halls of Congress, you're meeting in agencies. What IRCA did for me, because I was kind of traveling out there during legalization, is you got to meet the people who were the beneficiaries of your hard work. And as Muzaffar was saying, it's just enormously affirming.
I still meet the last thing, because it may have relevance to what Tenement Museum does. IRCA also provided, in a very oblique way, an opportunity for people to learn English. It was, you were present, you and I were present at the Jim Wright at the same meeting. At some point, not everyone was convinced we should do this. Tip O'Neill wasn't really convinced they should do it. But Jim Wright was the majority leader from Texas. At some point in the meeting with him, when he was trying to swallow, he said, could they at least learn some English? So we said, okay, where do we sign? And we got money. So it became that you would not become permanent resident unless you passed basic English test, or you were pursuing a course to learn 20 hours a week to learn English. And organizations got money. So the whole network of people today who you see providing ESL and citizenship came out of IRCA with government money, and then became the building blocks for the movement on education you see today.
Although you would appreciate this. This was a very classic insider deal, right? This is the majority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives saying, oh boy, I don't know if I can support amnesty unless, they make these guys learn English. And as Moose said, we're like, okay, because legalization was hanging by a thread this whole time. It was never popular and became less popular the longer the debate lasted. So we cut this deal. But the thing is, we didn't want to tell anybody we cut this deal, right? Because we were making it harder for people to legalize. Now, we were also thinking, not a bad idea for people to learn English. But, so it was one of these routine, quiet, under-the-radar deals that, at the same time, we didn't want to tell anybody we had actually cut.
Well, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut you off because we're running short on time before we get to Q&A. So really briefly, before we get to that, I want to sort of touch on what happened afterwards. Because as you said, this implementation, it helped build a movement and helped sort of create a lot of the modern world. But in many ways, it didn't succeed in closing the border. We see what's going on today, that a lot of these issues are still with us. And there is still actually now today majority support, generally speaking, for another path to legal status for the undocumented in the country. Charles, you wrote in your book that no set of domestic reforms, no matter how well designed, is likely to produce an immigration policy guaranteed to be both workable and sustainable over several decades. What do you sort of see coming out of IRCA sort of sets the stage for how we are today, and what do you think sort of Congress, if it ever turns its attention back to this in a more comprehensive way, should consider looking at? And a question for both of you.
Yeah, well, it doesn't take a genius to write that sentence, right? Immigration reform is hard, right? So one is, employer sanctions didn't work, and I think that really disappointed people. And not that it just disappoint people politically, is guess what? The unauthorized population kept growing. Right? So there was a problem. We also got, I think, a political and to some extent racialized pushback. Soon afterwards, it was Proposition 187 in California. Bill Clinton appointed a commission that proposed cutting legal immigration by a third. That resulted in a very negative enforcement-only bill in 1996. But I do think, having done it once, there is still among some of us the notion of, because this wasn't an easy path, that it's still doable and it's still worth trying. So, 3 takeaways. Didn't work. We got a lot of pushback, which is still happening, but, still worth going forward.
Very quickly, I think the ultimate drawback of WRCA was it was too narrowly focused on legalization. That we thought that if we did legalization, did sanctions, that our problems would come to an end. What we didn't do was provide legal mechanisms for people to come after WRCA. We knew that there was evidence that the labor market was going to need workers, and there was no provision for that. So people kept coming to do the needed jobs, but kept coming illegally. So this said this, that people are coming to meet the supply and demand, but are using illegal channels, is a direct consequence of the aftermath of WRCA. And that's a lesson. Don't do it again.
Yeah, although on that point, Muz is exactly right, but it's so hard to look around the corner, right? So yes, we didn't account for the growth of the U.S. economy and the need for more workers. But remember, in 1986, we were just 3 years out from a massive recession, a recession that really caused President Carter to lose, and it took nearly double-digit unemployment for us to get out of. So, right, most of us weren't in that the economy's going to grow massively mode. We were in the, immigrants aren't going to take your jobs mode.
Yeah, all right. Well, with that, I think we're moving on to Q&A next. So, yeah, we'll turn it over to that.
Great. So I think we'll start with a question from in the room.
Thank you so much. I was struck by what you said in the beginning about the personalities that were necessary in making WRCA work and being able to put the three-legged stool together. So wondering now, if we want to try to think forward and think about potential future immigration legislation, who would those people possibly be in Washington right now? So I know there are so many wonderful analysts and looking and studying and so many wonderful organizations, but which politicians kind of have, A, the interest in this, and B, the kind of, I guess, political savvy to do something? And I realize this is a hard question.
Well, the thing is that here we can be upset with young people that they're not achieving what Charles and I achieved. Not looking at her. No. But, it was a very different time. I mean, as people, normal order, regular order, as people call it in D.C., just doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. In the past, the reason Simpson and Mazzoli and Rodino were affected, there were chairs of committees, which had a lot of power. And what they did mattered. I mean, you all heard of TPS. If TPS was done completely because Joe Moakley became chairman of the Rules Committee. Like if you become chairman of the Rules Committee, you have one thing to push, every member of Congress will go aside and give you. That day has sort of gone. Having said that, there are obviously some people who have more leeway, I think. I mean, I think we saw a glimpse of that in the last border bill, that you had these very sort of unusual cast of characters like Langford. I mean, Langford is the ultimate nerdy Republican. He working with Chris Murphy.
He's going to run up that in the next
exactly. I mean, and with a colorful person like Kristen Sinema on the third side, and then you have Tillis on. These actually, for about months, were actually hatching a bill, which if Trump would not have put water over it, would actually have passed, even in this polarizing world. So it tells you that even in a polarizing world, there are actually cast of characters who can emerge with a potential of a bill.
Yeah, I think we probably don't know who is going to be leading the next set of reforms, because these days, in order to be popular, you kind of have to stay with your tribe. And orthodoxy is so powerful on both sides of the aisle. And one of the things that was characteristic about the previous generation was, I mean, it was a very different Congress, frankly, in the 80s than it was in the 60s. And those players adapted. So the next set of successful reformers are going to be people who use the current playing field, which is very different than it was in the 80s, and probably go against political orthodoxy and conventional wisdom more than once. And I would just finally say, and it's going to take some guts. And, you know, honestly, we don't have a lot of that frankly, either in the politician class or in the advocacy world.
Thank you for a wonderful discussion. It's been very illuminating. I'm not sure if my question is out of the scope of the conversation, but I was curious when you said earlier part of the value was being workers were no longer able to be exploited in the way they were initially. But once that happened, did that have an immediate effect on the economy in terms of having to pay more money to workers? Did prices increase sort of rapidly and quickly? Did it have an immediate effect, basically, is my question.
You know, it's hard to disentangle these kinds of effects, right? We're talking about 3 million workers in a workforce of, I don't know, what was then probably 100 million. I can tell you this, those workers' lives improved substantially. Their wages went up, they became homeowners, their kids' educational attainment improved, their poverty rates reduced. I mean, all the things you would expect, right? If you go from in the shadows to into the formal labor market. And then, you know, you can just kind of look at the trajectory of the economy. It certainly didn't appear to have any negative drag on the economy. I think culturally, it did add to changing demographics, because quite frankly, some of those people who legalized then got to petition for their relatives, and you know, it kind of accelerated demographic change. I think the pushback has been more cultural than economic.
Yeah, I'll just make only one point, because the point that Charles makes in his book, and we should not lose track of it. You know, when wages go up, you know, economics is a very funny thing. It's not just give and take. I mean, when wages go up, that also means their ability to spending goes up. They could become entrepreneurs if they didn't happen to become past. So for the overall economy, just because you give rights to it actually is helpful. Okay. Not to mention their children will do better. So if you have a narrow view of looking at something, you may see there was a decline. But if you look long term, it was a huge net gain. And the point that I think Charles makes in his book is that the most forgotten part about IRCA is it gave rise to Latino power in our country. That the number of Latinos grew as a result of IRCA, and then they sponsored their relatives, and those relatives sponsored more relatives. So the base increased. And you could say that's probably part of what is concerning to a lot of people. That look, all it means is we'll give rise to more Latinos and more Latino power. And if they believe the Latinos are unofficial members of the Democratic Party, why would you like to make more members of the Democratic Party? I think it is at some level about power, and we can't lose track of that. So and this never gets said because it's unpopular to say that, but there's a huge level of pull and push about power here.
Right, okay, I'm going to take the last question. I'm just wondering, right, hearing about implementation of IRCA and how it seemed like there was a relatively high level of success of coordination between the federal government and community organizations. wondering if you could speak a little bit to like what lessons that moment in the 80s can offer us for our current moment, where it seems like there's a lot of struggle to coordinate between different levels of government, particularly in sort of supporting new arrivals in New York City today.
I actually think there is an unspoken level of cooperation between federal government. Look, in this chapter, I'm telling you, this is not known. It's never happened in the history of our country that bureaucrats of USCIS have come to shelters to help people fill their work authorization documents. No one knows about it.
That's great. I didn't know about
Okay,
that.
no one knows about it.
Tell us more.
You know, that's the level of, Biden administration never gets credit for what it does. So they did this unusual case. Partly was driven by the political impetus coming from the mayor and the governor in this state that would work. They took this extra step. Okay, they have now in the process automated work authorization. In a way, I happen to do a work authorization application myself because I gave up on lawyers fleecing people. I was able to get a work authorization within 24 hours, doing it online.
And of course, bringing it online into the 21st century, that's only been done. I mean, a lot of this stuff online is really just in the last few years. Until very recently, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services didn't even take credit cards, to give you some sense of how out of date that system is.
And
they have
COVID,
modernized
and
a lot.
COVID strangely helped here. The bureaucracy got used to remote working. I mean, I've now become a big fan of remote hearings in immigration judges, because you can actually have someone smart, sitting in New York in her pajamas, representing you, as against some guy who's sort of, trying to maddeningly look at his tie in the detention center in Dallas. Really. That has been made possible by COVID. And so the automation is a huge part of what people are calling the e-justice now. There is an e-justice movement, and INS and USCIS should not be left behind.
Yeah, the other element of the infrastructure that's important, not just in New York, but elsewhere, is the number of non-lawyers assisting immigrants. There is a system called accredited representatives that you have to pass a test and you can practice certain kinds of immigration law. There were probably maybe a couple of dozen of those in the country in 1986. And there are 2,500 or so now. There really should be a lot more. So there aren't enough, and frankly, there will never be enough lawyers to go around. I mean, particularly at a time when you've got such huge migration, and because immigration law is devilishly complex, and so many things can go wrong. So the more we can augment the core of lawyers that we have through non-lawyer accredited reps and others, and then using technology, I think that's part of the key to the future.
Just imagine, Tenement Museum members are future representatives in immigration proceedings. They could be some of the best. You just, as long as you train them and supervise them, they will be the kind of people who will take it to the scale that we need to happen.
Yeah, we have, I think, over 2,500 members, so we can double.
I think that's the perfect place to end. We have 2,500 members. If each of you watching becomes designated representative, that's our call to action. Thank you all so much for helping to untangle the complexity of immigration law for us. And thank you all for watching.
Thank you.